Good evening. It is so very good to see all of you here. And if you happen to be visiting with us, thank you so very much for coming our way. We hope you're encouraged by your time with us and want to come back and be with us anytime that you can. Just a couple of announcements real quickly before our devotional. Please pick up a copy of the announcements. There are many things on the announcements. We're just going to highlight a couple that's a little bit more timely than some of the others. On our prayer list, we especially want to remember the youth group fall retreat is this weekend, and we certainly want to remember them as they go on the fall retreat. Also, the midlifers are having a costume party on the 26th. That is at 6 p.m. Rachel Lambert is the point of contact for that, and you need to RSVP if you haven't already, and payment is due by tonight. And so that's for the midlifers. And then finally, we want to remember the congregational wedding shower that's going to be for McCarley and Andrew. That's going to be this Sunday evening after services. Please bring lots of finger foods and desserts to share. And McCarley and Andrew are registered at the Knot, Amazon, Dillard's, and Crate and Barrel. In our Devo tonight, Daryl is going to be leading us in song. Harris is going to lead the closing prayer, and I'm going to give the Devo. Daryl?
We praise thee, O God, for the Son, for Jesus who died and is now gone above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. We praise thee, O God, for the Spirit of life, who has shown us our Savior and Savior our night. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. All glory and praise to the Lamb that was slain, who has borne all our sins and has removed every stain. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again.
Well, I made a choice today. Some of you have made the same choice recently. Some of you will make the same choice in the days ahead. Leola's planning to make her choice next Wednesday, her first opportunity. I'm talking about, of course, the choice of who I think is best suited to lead us as a nation. It is an important choice. Choices have consequences, you know. And so drove over to the library this morning, got there about 25 till over here next door, and kind of set the car for about 5 minutes. And then about 20 till, it opened at 8, by the way, about 20 till, I decided to get up and head to the door about the same time several others did. So I was about 7th in line as we stood there and waited for 8 o'clock. So I just patiently stood there listening to an audio book, waiting for 8, waiting to make my choice. Like I said, it's an important choice. I'm so thankful that we live in a country where we have an opportunity to give a voice to our communities, our nation, to choose those that we believe is going to be best to help us flourish as a people. Choice, it's an important one. But you know what? It's not the most important choice I've ever made. Those choices, no matter how important, will always pale in comparison to the most important choice of all. The most important choice that anyone makes is whether or not to give their life to Jesus Christ. It's the most important choice because, see, that's a choice that's going to have eternal consequences. The choice I made today, that's not going to have eternal consequences. But whether or not you choose Jesus to lead you is going to have eternal consequences. Have you made your choice about Jesus? If you haven't, you've got an opportunity tonight. Make your choice. Choose to follow him. With this choice, you're guaranteed to win. With this choice, there is eternal blessings. So if you haven't chosen to give your life to Christ by confessing him as the risen Lord, by repenting of your sins and being buried with him in baptism, why don't you make that choice tonight? If you made that choice, but maybe you've wandered away, you need to make a choice again, whether to come back to him or stay on the course that even though you may be here tonight, that you've been following the choice of the world. That choice isn't going to get you anywhere. That choice is bound to lose. And so if you're on the wrong road and you need to get back to Christ, choose that tonight. If you need to do that in a public way, we'd love to pray with you and for you. And so if there's anything that you need to do to make your life right with Jesus, choose to do that tonight while together we stand and while we sing.
Let's bow. Lord, we thank you for this day, for all that you blessed us with. Thank you that we are able to gather here this evening safely, and we thank you for this country in which we're able to worship you freely. Thank you for this church here at Concord Road, for the elders that guide us, and the teachers that help devote time for us to learn. Thank you for Mr. Darrell and his song leading tonight, and for Dan and his preparation of your word to deliver to us. Thank you for all of those who are helping us search for our new youth minister, Lord. Just please guide them in that decision. We ask that you be with the youth and guide each of us as we face challenges in the world. Keep us all safe as we head to fall retreat this weekend as well. We ask that you be with us now as we go to class, guide our teachers, and help all of us to be enriched through learning tonight in your word. And keep us safe as we head home tonight. And thank you most of all for Jesus and the price that he paid on the cross. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.
Am I on? I am on. Thank you. Well, good evening. I appreciate Dennis and Tim, Tim covering for me the last couple of weeks and giving y'all a little variety too in this class. I knew that I was giving Dennis about an hour and a half worth of material, which he did his best with in 45 minutes that we have here, but he did very well with that. And then I'm getting a political call again every night this time, yes. and Tim had a good take on it last week also about trying to help us do what I'm trying to do in this class is to see what it was like living back in Bible times, and he had a different little twist to that was enjoyable. But we'll get back to this tonight. And I spent the last couple of weeks in a time zone very different from this one. We were in Italy, and in Italy right now it's 2:15 in the morning, and I still am on that pretty much. That pew right there is yelling at me, come to me and sleep. And I would love to listen, but I'm going to try to stay awake here till 8 o'clock and in long enough to drive home too. So, but anyhow, glad to be back for this. Glad to be back in the USA also. Well, we're still continuing on our manners and customs of Bible times, and when I was here last. I guess that was 3 weeks ago, we were talking about earning a living and with agriculture, and we talked about the Egyptian and Canaanite agriculture, and about grain crops, growing wheat and barley. That was their main grain crops. And we talked some about plowing. Here's a picture that I did not have at that time, but it does show let me get my marker on here. The farmer plowing with the yoke of oxen, and you notice how his plow here has comes up and attaches to the yoke. So that's how he's attached to the oxen there. And then we talked about the goad that they could use to prod the oxen. Then, so now we're going to move on to the next step of talking about harvesting the crops. And the harvest fields that they had were divided into paths, and it was permitted to pick the growing grain beside the path. People particularly enjoyed it in the springtime before the grain had hardened. We have a case of Jesus' disciples eating the ripening grain. In Luke 6, verse 1, it said, "One Sabbath Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels." And this was allowed in the law. In Deuteronomy 23:25, it said, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain." And of course, at the time the disciples went through eating that grain, the Pharisees were giving them grief about that, but it wasn't because they were picking the grain, it's because they were doing it on the Sabbath, and had a problem with that. But when the grain was ready for harvesting, the standing grain was cut by sickle, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's a handheld crescent-shaped tool with a sharp inner cutting edge that you can cut the grains with. In early times, it would be made of wood or even a large jawbone of an animal, and the flints would be set there in the jawbone along the inner edge. But in later times, they had metal sickles were available. And here's another photo of harvesting the grain with the sickle. The stalks were cut near the top, and the remainder was left in the ground for the grazing of the sheep. Now, the stalks were tied into bundles or sheaves, and if you remember Joseph's dream that he had in Genesis 37:7, where he said the 11 sheaves were bowing down to the one, meaning his brothers bowing down to him, that when they were tied into bundles, then they were loaded onto donkeys or put into a cart to be taken away for threshing, which we'll get to in a minute. Normally they're cut by a group of people working together, but the corners of the fields had to be left for the poor. The Leviticus 23:22 said, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." The poor were also allowed to walk behind the reapers and pick up or glean anything the reapers had missed. Deuteronomy 24:19 said, "When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." And the story of Ruth is set against such a background. She was able to fill the large skirt of her robe with what she had collected. Grain was very dry at the time of reaping, so there was a danger of fire. And this was often exploited by enemies, especially in times of war. And it would seriously weaken the conditions of the people who owned the crops. In Judges 15:1-5, we read of Samson taking advantage of this to attack the Philistines. When it said, "Later on at the time of wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, 'I'm going to my wife's room.' But his father would not let him go in. 'I was so sure you thoroughly hated her,' he said, 'that I gave her to your friend. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead.' Samson said to them, 'This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them.' So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails. Sorry. Lit the torches and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain, together with the vineyards and olive groves." Now, I believe that Samson found a rather creative method of warfare here. I doubt that most enemies did it that way, with tying foxes together, but he did burn down their grain. Next would come the threshing. Excuse me, I've got dried out throat here or something. All right. The separation of the grain from the straw was done on the threshing floor, which could be any hard, compacted surface, whether smooth rock or compacted earth. And if there were only small quantities that were involved, the threshing was sometimes done by beating the grain with a flail, which is a long, flexible stick. Now, I know this illustration is not from Bible times. It looks more like Amish maybe, but they're using the flail to beat the grain, to beat the plant, to separate the grain from the straw. Ruth used this method, and Gideon did the same when he was using the stone bottom of a wine press. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. In Judges 6, verse 11, it said, "The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites." Instead of doing it on their usual threshing floor where the Midianites might find him, he was hidden away in a wine press, and because the Midianites were coming and ruining all their crops, just like swarms of locusts. And again, kind of like the way Samson was doing. Oxen were other means of threshing. There were a pair of oxen would be yoked together and driven around the threshing floor by a boy, and their sharp hooves did the rest, just beating it down. And in fact, the root meaning of the Hebrew word for thresh is to trample, which comes from this threshing practice. In Deuteronomy 25:4, it says, "Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain." So the oxen were allowed to eat while they were doing this. And this is quoted twice in the New Testament. The New Testament uses this to lay down the principle that ministers and elders should be able to live from their ministry. In 1 Corinthians it says, "Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? Do I say this merely from a human point of view? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain.' Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you?" This is also quoted in 1 Timothy 5, where it says, "The elders who direct the affairs of the church are well worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, 'Do not muzzle the ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages.'" There's been a lot of times that at Christmas we'll get a ham, one of those spiral sliced hams, so it's no big deal, but after I've warmed it up for the meal, I'll be cutting out those pieces and trying to arrange them nicely on a dish. But then there's also these little pieces, and I'll just take one ever so often, and I'll quote this verse: "Do not muzzle the ox while it is treading out the grain." I think I have every right to nibble a little bit on that ham. And we have one more photo here of the oxen treading the grain. At a later stage, the threshing sledge was invented. And this was, the oxen would pull it behind them. There were long planks of wood fixed side by side with flints sunk into the underside and fixed in place by a pitch. The sledge was driven over grain about 18 inches in depth. That's about like that. But it was a much quicker way of getting the job done. And of course, it obviously helped to have people get on to that to weigh it down. The grain fell through the straw to the hard surface below, but the straw was chopped up, which made excellent fodder for the animals. And here we have another drawing of the threshing sledge. And a quote from Isaiah 41 says, "See, I will make you into a threshing sledge, new and sharp, with many teeth." The next thing that came in the process was winnowing. And in the evening, when the breeze developed, the separated grain and the straw were gathered into a pile in the center and of the threshing floor for winnowing. And the farmer used a 5-prong fork called a winnowing fan, and he would just scoop it up, throw the mixture in the air. The heavier grain fell back down, and then the straw would blow away by the wind. And the chaff was gathered up and used to fire stoves in the homes, and straw was collected for the animals. And when they got down to the point where there was very little left, they would use a winnowing shovel to pick up the very last bits of it. And here we have a photo of this process as well. And the next verse in Isaiah 41 said, "You will winnow them, the wind will pick them up, and a gale will blow them away." And one more step here, sifting. The grain had to be purified by sifting. The wheat and the barley grains were mixed with all kinds of loose fragments from the threshing floor. So everything was put in large sieves, and allowed the grain to pass through, but left most of the trash behind. This kind of reminds me of those screens you see the archaeologists using to sift things, although it's the opposite for them. They're trying to get the dirt to fall through and leave the things of value or interest on the top. In this case, they were getting the grain to fall through and the things that needed to be disposed of on top. But it was necessary at this stage to remove any darnel grains. And darnel is a ryegrass, and you may wonder, what are you talking about? Well, this is known as tares or weeds in the New Testament. And it's known also as false wheat, even today. In Matthew 13, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." And these tares, or this darnel, looks identical to wheat until the grain ripens. And that's when the grain of the darnel becomes black instead of yellow-brown like the wheat. And it says the grains are bitter and cause dizziness and sickness or even death if eaten. In fact, the scientific name for this darnel is the Latin for the word drunk. Well, when this part of the work was done, the farmer normally stayed with the grain at night, camping out on the threshing floor to ensure that the harvest was not stolen. And again, we see this in Ruth. In Ruth chapter 3, that's when the workers are staying there on the threshing floor with everything they put all this work into to make sure nobody steals that. We also have a picture here of the separation of good and bad. This was used as a picture of what God will do to judge his people. Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish." Jeremiah 15:7 says, "I will winnow them with a winnowing fork at the city gates of the land. I will bring bereavement and destruction on my people, for they have not changed their ways." In Matthew 3, verse 12, John the Baptist uses this whole process to illustrate the work of Jesus. He said, "His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gathering his wheat into the barn and burning up the chaff with unquenchable fire." And in Luke 22:31, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat." This is when Jesus was telling Peter that he was going to deny him 3 times. And when he said this, he was probably referring to the physical shaking of the sieve. So I hope this gives you some better visual ideas of when you read these things in the Bible, when you come across these references. Any questions or comments about this part before I move to the next step? That's a good question. How did they know how to do all this? And I'm sure it was a process of trial and error through generations. That's something I think about often when you're eating a piece of food and you're thinking, why did somebody decide to try to taste this at some point, or how did they figure out to cook it this particular way? How did they figure out all this stuff? Yeah. That's the only way I know to answer it, is it came through years of trial and error. Just as hopefully since then we've learned more things, how to do things. All right. I'll look next at vines, another form of agriculture. Well, at the personal level, every Jew wanted to have his own vine growing on a trellis beside his house, providing shade during the hot summer. And in fact, in 1 Kings 4:25, it says that during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, that means from all the way north, all the way south, lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. So they did have such an ideal situation at that time. But they did find, apparently through trial and error, that it was most economical for a whole village to invest in its own vineyard. Kind of combined all their efforts into that. However, in good vine-growing country, the small vineyards were bought up by absentee landlords, and so the small-time farmers became tenant farmers, receiving a percentage of the produce as payment. Jesus mentioned this in Luke 20, verses 9 and 10. He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And here we have a photo of a makeshift shelter built of branches, leaves, and sacking. This was used by a farmer to keep watch over his land. Process of building a vineyard is outlined in Isaiah 5, 1 and 2. I think we must have walked about 2,000 miles in the last 2 weeks, and my legs are still feeling it. And Isaiah says, "My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well." And also in Matthew 21:33, Jesus talks about how to build a vineyard. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Now, the vineyard was placed on the hillside where there was good drainage and where grapes could catch the sun. The land was terraced first. They used up stones that were in the way and that littered the soil, and so that they would get them out of the way and provide a means of soil conservation during the heavy rains. And this photo here also shows the terraced areas. You can see that along this hill area, and I believe some over here as well, where they're using every bit of land that they can. The plot was then surrounded by a wall and a ditch, and a fence of thorns would be placed on top of the wall to keep out damaging wild animals. Song of Solomon references this in 2 verse 15. "Catch for us the foxes, the little foxes that ruin the vineyards, our vineyards that are in bloom." So they wanted to keep out foxes. Psalm 80, 12 and 13 says, "Why have you broken down its walls so that all who pass by pick its grapes? Boars from the forest ravage it, and the creatures of the field feed on it." So just like That's why I don't try to grow a garden today, because I don't want to fight the animals trying to eat it all. I know that's what would happen, but same problem they had back then. Well, the law allowed grapes to be picked as long as they were not carried away in a container, much like the wheat situation or the grains. In Leviticus 19:10, it says, "Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." And in Deuteronomy 23:24, it says, "If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain." Finally, a watchtower was built that served as a summer cottage, a place for the family to stay during the summer while the grapes were being picked. And it was not a cheap thing to build. Again, Jesus mentions this in Luke 14. "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will he not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? If he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.'" And the upper story of the tower could be used as a lookout post. And if the owner couldn't afford a tower, the workers just set up a tent. Now, the harvesting of the grapes, which is known as the vintage. Pruning was done during the winter months to get rid of weak, broken, or diseased branches. This was referred to as cleaning the vine. And in fact, John 15, again, Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you." So we are being pruned or made clean by the teaching Jesus has given us. Well, they began picking the grapes in July, but that would continue into September. The whole village might move into the vineyards because the work had to be completed quickly. In Judges 9:27, it talks about the celebrations. After they had gone into the fields and gathered the grapes and trodden them, they held a festival. And harvesting grapes was hard work during Bible times, but there was singing, dancing, and celebration. And the celebrations were so much a part of the vintage that if they were absent, it would be seen as a mark of God's judgment. Isaiah 16:10 says, "Joy and gladness are taken away from the orchards. No one sings or shouts in the vineyards. No one treads out wine at the presses, for I have put an end to the shouting." Well, everyone would bring huge baskets to place the grapes in. They used small sickle knives to cut the clusters of grapes from the vines. Some grapes were eaten fresh or pressed to provide fresh grape juice. And if you remember going back to Joseph again in Genesis 40, when the man known as the butler or the cupbearer of Pharaoh tells Joseph his dream, he said he was pressing a bunch of grapes into Pharaoh's cup, making grape juice for him. And the book I'm working out of also said fresh grape juice was used for laxative purposes. Other grapes were dried to produce raisins. They were laid out in a corner of the vineyard and then turned daily and sprinkled with olive oil. Raisins are mentioned several times in the Old Testament because they were a staple food. Well, the wine press. There were far too many grapes to be utilized in making raisins, and most were pressed for their juice. The wine press was a cistern cut out of rock with an exit hole at the bottom. It also could be a shallow plastered vat made of stone. The juice ran out of the hole into a vat or other collecting vessels. And several people at once would get into the cistern and tread the grapes with their feet with great laughter and enjoyment. But as we've seen so often before, the prophets see judgment in a time when there is no joy or singing, as there would have normally been in happier times. Jeremiah 48:33 says, "Joy and gladness are gone from the orchards and fields of Moab. I have stopped the flow of wine from the presses. No one treads them with shouts of joy. Although there are shouts, they are not shouts of joy." Well, men would fill storage jars with the juice and then seal the jars with a linen stopper and put them aside and allow them to ferment. If you look at these pictures here, first of all, this oil lamp over here shows two men treading the grapes, almost like they're dancing around doing it. And of course, up here, we've got just about every stage in the process. It shows them bringing the grapes with the oxen bringing it by wagon or the donkey or just carrying them in, and then the lady throws some more grapes in there, and all these men are stripped for work. If you remember that term that we looked at earlier, they're down to their loincloth, but stomping around in there having a good old time. And you notice this one right here it reminds me of "Do not muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain." He's grabbed some of that grapes and just having some right then to enjoy. Well, then down here, as the juice flows down into this vat here, they are scooping it up with pitchers and then carrying it over here to pour in these jugs, which will be sealed up, as I said. And one thing I read was that they will be sealed, but there would be a slight opening near the handle to allow gases to escape, so it wouldn't build up too much pressure inside there in the fermentation. Well, most of the grape was made into to wine, but that was not simply for pleasure. Back then it was a necessity. I think we've looked at it before, where the water was unsafe for drinking unless it came from a fresh spring, and milk supply was very limited. So they most of the time had to drink wine. And then next, when we were in Israel, at Nazareth Village, there is a wine press there. In fact, the wine, as I understand it, the wine press was discovered there, and it dates back to time of Jesus, and then this Nazareth village was built around it to show how things were done back then. But you see, the man there, and I've got a couple other pictures that show it a little closer, is actually standing where they would have been stomping out the grapes. And if you can't really see it very well in this picture, it'll get better in a minute, but right in here is a little depression that's been cut into the rock there and to help it to flow down into that lower area there. This next picture, well, now why did, I don't want that there. Okay. Oh, I know why they did that. Okay. Again, up here is where the man was standing a minute ago, and again, that would be the place where they would be walking on the grapes. And again, it flows right through a little cut in the stone right there down into this area here. And I'm going to have to get rid of those again. And then this is a close-up looking straight onto it again, where you would step on it. You see the depression in there coming down here where the juice would have collected, and they would have to bring it out of there. This was an actual wine press that we got to see there. And also, there was another place we went to where this was an even larger one. You can't tell, there's no people in the picture, but this upper part here would have been the part where the grapes were that they were walking on. It's actually covered with a mosaic floor, and I'd say it was probably maybe 10 by 12 feet, and then the large pit down here for the juice to flow down into. So just to give you some idea, and that might also give an idea of how Gideon could have been threshing at a wine press, because it was probably one that was large like this. All right. Then a couple of words about wine making. The grape juice was allowed to stand and ferment in the jars for about 6 weeks. Then it was filtered into large storage jars and sealed with clay stoppers. And some would be stored in a cool, dark place, such as a cistern. That's what shows them doing here. They're putting it down into the cistern. And that could be stored that way for up to 3 years. Then the wine could also be carried in wine skins, which we see over here. Okay. Any comments or questions about grapes and wine making? Okay. Well, next we'll look at olive growing. Olive trees were a vital element of food supply, and they were grown by inserting a graft from a cultivated tree into a wild one. Then the wild part was cut down to the ground, and they just have the cultivated tree to grow. And an olive tree takes about 15 years to grow to maturity, but then it bears fruit for centuries. And the old roots will even throw up new stems, and that gave Isaiah this picture in Isaiah 11 verse 1, where he makes a messianic prophecy. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The new shoots were grafted into the stalks. Paul says that when the Gentiles as well as the Jews were able to have salvation, it was as if, contrary to the normal practice, a wild olive were being grafted into a cultivated one. Romans 11, 17, 18 says, if some of the branches have been broken off, and you, the Gentiles, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not boast over those branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Now, the olive tree was not very attractive in itself, or is not. They're about 18 feet high when fully grown, and the bark is very gnarled, and leaves have a dull green coloration, but they take on a silvery sheen in the sunshine. In the spring, the tree is covered with white blossoms, and the falling blossoms look like a shower of snowflakes, which reminds me of the pear trees and cherry trees that we have around here. Apparently that happened earlier than mid to late April, because I don't remember any flowers on the olive trees when we were there. The fruit was ready for picking in September and October. They'd lay a large cloth under the tree, and then the branches were beaten to shake the olives onto the cloth. But the strange thing about beating the branches to get the olives loose probably damaged the tender young shoots that were coming up for the next year, and so there was a poor crop the following year. So it kind of resulted in alternate good and bad years for the crop, or for that particular tree, those trees. Here we have a photo of the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem, and with several olive trees there. And I want you to notice, I hope that shows pretty good. How's that look back there? There's this tree right here. It looks pretty small, like a young tree. But that sign, the sign on there says it was planted by Pope Paul VI in 1964. So it's a 60-year-old tree. Still looks like it's got some growing to do, especially compared to some of the others in the garden. That's one that, of course, would be centuries old. I did some reading on that where they tried to date some of those trees. They best they could do is they found that some of them date back to 11th or 12th century. Highly unlikely that any of them were standing when Jesus was around, but they very possibly could be from trees that were there at that time, the way that they keep on putting up new shoots from the roots. Now, the olive press is how they dealt with the olives after they were harvested. Many olives were eaten with barley bread, and that constituted the normal breakfast for a working man. I had mentioned before that they might grab olives and bread on their way out the door to go to work. The olives were preserved by immersing them in salt water. But the main importance of the crop was its oil. The olive press was probably close to the orchard to minimize damage to the olives during transport. And in fact, the word Gethsemane means the oil press. So there must have been an olive press nearby to Gethsemane. The olive press itself is a large or flat cylindrical stone that you can see here, and it would be hollowed out on the top to provide a large shallow saucer for that's where the olives would be placed. And then the stone wheel was set up on and rotated around the saucer, crushing the olives. And that resulted in the pulp of the olives, which would be treated later to extract the oil. Here's a picture of one that we saw over in Israel at one place with the wheel turned over there, and another one with the wheel standing up, but it would go around inside there. And in fact, we have a video here with an animal known as Brian Jones showing us how this would work. And I guess that's about all the work he wanted to do, but that's what we got there. There would be a second pressing of the oil or the olives to obtain the oil. The pulp that came from that first pressing that we saw would be placed either in stacks of baskets containing the pulp that would be squeezed with a screw thread like you see on the left, or like the one on the right by a wooden beam that's levered down by these big weights. And the crop from just one tree would produce about 20 gallons of oil. And as I mentioned, Gethsemane meant oil press. Here is, again, a picture of the oil press with the screw thread type press that would turn that thing and kind of like turning a vice, crushing down on it. And also at Nazareth Village, we saw this huge thing, a huge beam here with these large weights down below that were helping to pull that lever down, and then and pushing, and this is that beam again up here, pushing down where the pulp of the olives would be. And so it took a lot of work to get the oil out of there. Let's mention one more thing here, we're about out of time. One thing I've noticed, of course we saw this again in Italy, there's olive oil everywhere, and it'll say extra virgin olive oil. The first time I ever saw that some years ago, I thought, extra virgin. I thought you were either virgin or not virgin. I don't, what is this extra virgin? But I found out that is the first pressing. That is what the oil would be that comes out at this time that we've been talking about. Now, sometimes they can take that oil and press it again to refine it even more. That's just virgin olive oil. And they can even go another time. I've forgotten what they call that. Although I've never seen those. All you ever see is extra virgin. And they say that's the healthiest one. It's got everything that the antioxidants and whatever all else is supposed to be in there that's healthy about it. We got a minute or two left. Any comments or questions? It's a good place to stop right here. Well, thank you very much. I'm still vertical. I'm still awake. I can't believe it.